Hi everyone, welcome to Quick Watercolour Birds, and in this episode I'm going to be painting a bird with some really awesome shapes, a nice bit of light. Let's have a look. So in this particular video I am going to be painting a Great Blue Heron. This is a request that I've had, and I've had loads of these. If you've got a bird you would like to see me paint, please do pop it into the comments down below. I'm going to slowly work through them. I think I've already got about 30 or so. But this particular bird, as I said, it's got these amazing shapes. Like, I love the head shape and the elongated beak for starters. The way that kind of neck then curves into the body and all of this sort of interesting positive and negative shapes that it creates between the body and the neck and the head is really fantastic. When we start to add on to that these beautiful soft colours, which are an opportunity to let lots of washes kind of flow together and melt together, and a really beautiful feeling of light kind of falling across the head and onto the body, giving us kind of form and even a little bit of detail. This is just a fantastic painting subject and I can't wait to get stuck in, so let's have a look. So I've got a really simple combination of brushes. We've got my size 0 Jackson's Raven mop. It's a synthetic squirrel hair. It's got a lovely softness to it, holds loads of pigment, loads of water, but it also comes to a really fine point. And then I'm kind of dropping down in size to a number 10 round brush. This is a Proline brush. It's a little bit stiffer, doesn't hold as much water and pigment, but as a result it's a little bit more controllable. But it's also big enough to do some bigger brush strokes, and it's great for dry brush work. I'm working on Canson Moulin de Roy paper. It's 100% cotton. It's got a little bit of texture to it, the cold press texture, which I really love. My drawing is very simply done with an HB pencil and just a rubber to slightly lighten it in places. As always, I'm looking for these kind of simple but accurate shapes. The big thing being the proportion of these shapes in relation to each other, and then also the placement of these shapes in relation to each other. So, you know, how far does the beak protrude past the curve of the neck? How far is the curve of the neck beyond the roundness of the body? What sort of angle are these shapes at if I was to draw a line through them? The head, the beak, the body. Everything else kind of gets stuck onto that afterwards. So big shapes first, general shapes first, moving towards the smaller specific shapes. And then very finally we look for those little details, and I even start to draw in some little lines to represent light and shadow, and then we can kind of be a bit more free form with some of the background areas, and I'm going to talk you through all of this in real time. So for my colours, ultramarine blue is going to be a really important one here. That lovely soft warm purpley grey is going to be perfect for all of these kind of soft colours. I do have a phthalo blue out. It's really only going to be useful in this case if I want to push things a little bit more vibrant and turquoise, and it is going to help with mixing some really deep rich darks if I put a red in there as well. You don't really need phthalo blue. You could get away with just ultramarine as long as you can mix a deep dark. But it is there and I find it useful. Quinacridone red is definitely going to be my main red here. It's our lovely cool red. You could easily use another magenta or something like an alizarin crimson. Again, the pyrrole red isn't really necessary. I've just kind of got it there. It may help me get some of my deep darks, but you could probably get away with taking it out. New Gamboge yellow is that lovely warm orangey yellow. And it's only really going to be useful to create the strong orange in the beak. It's also going to be having a yellow on the palette that I'm going to use to subdue the purples, to kind of grade them down a bit, which I'll talk about in the actual painting. And for that you could really use any yellow, ideally a transparent one. I've also got Aureolin yellow out, and you could easily just use this one because it can still make nice clean oranges. You could also use a cadmium orange as well, but the Aureolin yellow is the cool one. Great for really vibrant greens. If I decide I want to push my turquoises a little bit more greeny but keep the vibrancy, Aureolin yellow is perfect for that. And I could use the phthalo blue and the yellow to make a turquoise, but I actually really love the turquoise colour by Holbein. I generally always have it out, and you'll see me use that a little bit. So those are my basic colours. You could easily cut out at least a few of those and work with quite a limited palette and be perfectly fine. I will talk about the colours as I paint. Let's get into it. So a lot of the colours in this are going to be kind of mixing greys. So mixing these greys, I mean we're kind of balancing all three primaries. So we know that if we create a purple out of, say, red and blue, and in this case ultramarine blue and quinacridone red, so that gives us a lovely vibrant purple, But if I then decide that purple is too strong, or it's too purpley, it's too saturated, adding water will lighten it, but it might keep the same intensity of colour, yet adding the complementary, which is the only other primary aside from the red and the blue, so the complementary being yellow, if I add increasingly or little touches of yellow, it effectively cancels out the purple and brings it to a lovely muted colour. How much yellow I add dictates how much of a purple feel it has. So this has kind of started with a very intense purple, and then I've added just little touches of yellow to give me this much softer purple. And I'm coming in and mapping in the basic shadow shape of the head. I want to leave a nice light shape on the front of the neck, and kind of looking to keep it very soft, and I'm just laying in an initial wash with a view that I'm going to go back in and drop in more colour. I'm using my size 0 Jackson's Raven mop here. As I said at the start, it's got a lovely body to it, it holds lots of water and pigment, but it also comes to a nice fine point. This starting wash is probably about milky coffee consistency, and then I mix in a little bit of the kind of phthalo blue, maybe even a little touch of the ultramarine. Just while the existing wash is wet, I kind of hit the edge of it with this new mixture, and this new mixture is probably getting up to like full fat milk consistency, so it's just a little bit more pigment in it. I'm going to try and talk about colour mixing a fair bit, but really this is a combination of the three primaries looking for variations of grey. And when I have that grey start point, or that kind of muted start point, I'm basically just tinting it in different directions and adjusting the strength of the colour. So I got that very neutral grey by mixing a fairly equal amounts of the yellow and the red and the blue. Then obviously the more bluey grey, I just increase the intensity of the blue, and you can keep kind of starting with a kind of middle ground grey and then tinting it in different directions with the different primaries. It's just a really nice way to work, and you get a kind of harmony to the colours. I'm letting all the colours run together here, but I'm also trying to leave some nice whites of the page. I'm holding the brush fairly low down because this is quite controlled, and there are some finer marks to be made, but I'm trying to keep the brush strokes themselves quite quick and quite immediate. I'm working on a slight slope here of maybe about 30 degrees or so, so if I start at the top and the wash kind of flows down the page a little bit. I'm now moving up to a slightly more intense paint consistency and loading the existing wash. So the wash on the page has probably dried off a little bit, but it's still very damp. The mixture I'm putting in, again, it kind of varies, but I'm in some places making a more intense kind of purple, in other places putting in that lovely blue, and it's probably about the same sort of paint consistency. We're still at kind of full fat milk consistency maximum, which is giving us just enough dark when there's some of the dark blue in there, but generally I'm keeping it fairly light. I continue that same wash out of the tail into the leg area. It's just off camera, but this is a turquoise colour by Holbein, which I really love, but it's an opaque colour. But when you kind of drop it in with your transparent colours, it tends to take on the transparency of some of those colours, and it can add a really nice kind of little accent colour. It's almost like a little shot of turquoise in amongst that blue and in amongst that purple, and it's just a nice little feature. You can see I really am working with fairly watery paint here. It's not too watery, there's not loads of water in it, it's not totally swimming in water, but it does have a good amount of water, but also a good amount of pigment. So again, we're maximum kind of milky or full fat milk consistency of paint. And I'm just kind of laying everything in, dropping in colours into different places, always remembering that our colour will dry slightly lighter and slightly weaker than we put it on, and the bigger or the larger amount of water you have in your mix, the bigger kind of colour shift that we'll see. So I feel like I can go very intense with the colours here and it will dry softer and more gentle. And also I'm kind of thinking that the lovely turquoise in the water is, in theory, is sort of reflecting back into the underside of the heron. And it's one of those things, I'm not like perfectly aiming for that as the thing, it's just a sort of an idea that's kind of influenced the colours to some extent. So we've got that lovely turquoise. and I've chosen to bring it into the water as a fairly obvious colour and then also drop it into the heron, but kind of in the lower underside, almost like it's reflecting back up into the underside of the heron there. In terms of the background, I'm going to use a large amount of negative white space, and I've offset the heron to the right, so not being scared to have a good amount of space around the heron. We may or may not use a slightly darker colour to kind of go around the top of the head. At this point I've kind of got everything laid in and I feel pretty happy with it. I'm just making minor adjustments, and then here, just to kind of get the paint moving, get a bit more of a dynamic feel in places, simply make it more exciting, I'm just kind of splashing some of that turquoise around. If it happens to drop into different parts of the heron, then great. If it drops into the water, great. So just coming into the head, and I've dropped down in size to the size 10 round brush. It's just a little bit stiffer and allows a little bit more control. I've mixed a stronger mixture of blue, it's very much dominant towards the ultramarine, and we're probably at about, it's probably still just full fat milk consistency, possibly even slightly more waterier than that. That's going to give it a lovely transparency, and it's also going to give it a lovely kind of gentle lightness. I find things like ultramarine, cobalt blue, whenever you've got kind of a very light grey or a white but in shadow, quite often ultramarine with a bit of water is a really good start point, and obviously you can add more water to make it a lighter shadow colour, keep the paint a little bit more concentrated to make it a darker shadow colour. So you can kind of balance it, and it just seems to work really well for kind of white or very light grey in shadow. It's my kind of go-to start point, because then I can always tint it to be a bit more red, a bit more quinacridone red, or a bit more yellow, a bit more green, whatever. It's kind of our start point, and we can tint from there. It might not look like much at the moment, but what I'm basically doing is just refining some of my shapes, and while the wash on the page is still damp, in some places kind of moist, very close to being dry, I'm just taking the opportunity to drop in kind of a single cream mixture of paint of the turquoise, which is going to give us a little bit more darker tone, and even pushing up towards a dark with the quinacridone red and a bit of phthalo, and just while it's still wet, taking the opportunity to drop some darker tone in. And what this does is it starts to stretch the contrast and push some of the darks in, but because we're working very much wet into wet or kind of damp into damp, those marks will always be nice and soft and have a gentleness to them. And you can see that I've just left a tiny slither of light on the front edge of the kind of right hand leg as we look at it. That's just to trap the light so that the leg is not just a dark shape against a lighter background. It becomes like a light edge against a slightly darker background. So I let that dry off completely, and actually in this case I sped the process up with a hairdryer. You can see all the colours have kind of softened down, the lighter colours have gone even lighter, whereas the stronger darker colours have stayed a little bit closer to how we put them on. We start to see that they've dried with a little bit of texture, and as a start point I'm really happy with that. I've not gone too dark too quickly, but I've pushed in a few little darker tones, and I've got a really nice base to work into there. So I kick off with a new gamboge kind of yellow, warm yellow mixture, and I just lay in the very simple underside of the beak here using the size 10 brush. I kind of err on the side of leaving a good amount of light on the top half of the beak, because that's where the light is going to be hitting. I'm not sure at this point exactly how I'm going to tackle the beak. Am I going to use a bit of line to trap the light? Am I going to use a bit of colour behind the head? I'm not sure, but again, if I err on the side of less, I can always add more. With watercolour, it can be tricky if you add too much to kind of come back from that. It is possible, but it's easier to do less and then add more. And then I'm kind of straight to a single cream mix of consistency now, because we're into some of the darker tones, and also I want a bit more control. The yellow is naturally a lighter colour, so to darken it down but keep it a kind of oranginess, which is going to offset a lot of the cooler colours in the body and the water, I add a little bit of quinacridone red and I drop it in while it's still damp. We get a nice soft transition of colour, but there's also an intensity to that colour as well, because I'm not using the paint as watery. So, you know, the thicker we use the paint, the less water that's in there basically, the kind of more intense and strong the colour is, because obviously the water kind of softens it down. Although if we're mixing grey colours, that's not so relevant, but it will still be dark grey and it will have an intenseness to it. So I'm trying to keep it really simple here. It's quite hard at this scale in many ways to keep it simple. It's very easy on a small scale when we drop down to a smaller brush and we're holding the brush a little bit closer to the hairs. It can be easy to start doing too many small little shapes and trying to be a bit too clever with things. So what I'm trying to do here is we have a very complex head and beak. There's actually lots of different parts to the head, lots of different features, some quite contrasting colours between the orange and the purples and the blues, so if they meet too much they will kind of cancel each other out, so I have to be slightly wary of that. But working with a similar consistency of paint and just kind of taking my time, working from left to right, I slowly kind of map out the head. So this area I'm working on here is that beautiful dark marking kind of above the eye that links up to the beak. I'm not going dark straight away. I'm mixing a similar paint consistency to the beak. It's got a slightly purpley feel to it, and then I'm going to go back in while it's still damp with a much stronger mixture of almost neat paint. We're probably up to like double cream or even butter consistency of paint here, and then I strike that in with very kind of definite marks, but with a sensitivity to them, into the now wet wash in the head. And what's happening here is it allows me to get like a softness to the area. So within the area that I've just wetted and put colour down, if I drop colour into that, we'll get nice soft transitions of colour. But using the thicker, neat paint into a damp wash, it will kind of stay where it's put a little bit more. We'll still get that softness of edge where things have melted together. But because the paint I'm using is thicker, it won't completely melt and completely disappear into the existing wash on the page. So it kind of affords me a little bit more control. I can start to create some more gentle kind of gradients, and basically just take it easy, kind of map things in a little bit at a time. Once I'm confident with where they are, then I might go in and sharpen things up a little bit. I might go in and slowly start dropping in the darks. And you can see straight away, as soon as we start to put these darker tones on, it begins to feel more finished. And so one of my biggest mistakes I make is if a painting is feeling too light and too watery, I start to kind of rush things and I want to start making it feel more finished more quickly. And usually in watercolour, your darks are going to make things at least feel like they're getting towards being more finished. But one of the biggest mistakes I make is putting those darks on too soon. They can blend into the rest of the painting and kill everything kind of down, make it too heavy, make it too dark. So that's why I kind of like working with this kind of lovely lighter tones first, letting all the paint kind of flow together, linking the washes together. Then we come over the top with our darker tones in kind of smaller areas. Despite saying kind of smaller areas, I also think it's important that we kind of link our shadow shapes together as best as we can, rather than having lots of little isolated shapes of shadow. It can be nice to try and tie them together. So we've got this dark and shadow shape above the eye. We've then got this lovely little strong shadow on the kink of the neck just under the head. And then we've got this lovely shadow down the back of the neck, which describes not only the form but also the curve and the shape of the neck. Now if I was to do all of those as individual parts, it would feel a little bit fractured, maybe like a little bit too many bits going on, especially at this scale. And it would probably look messy. So what I'm doing is kind of tackling the individual parts, but then choosing to kind of bring them together, kind of unite them with some softer washes. So that doesn't mean that the whole wash has to be the same tone. So if we look at the very strong shadow on the kink of the neck under the head, that's a very dark tone. Then I've used a damp brush to pull some of that pigment, and that kind of desaturates the pigment, makes it softer and slightly lighter. I've kind of brought that across the neck and brought that into the shadow on the back of the neck. I've then in turn brought that down to meet the shadow in the rest of the curve of the neck, and then there's this other shadow on the underside of the neck which I've just done, and I've purposely decided to kind of only very slightly but link that in to the rest of the shadow. So what we end up with is kind of a variation of tone and even colour, little bits of detail, a sense of form, but essentially right from just below the eye all the way into the neck and then down the back of the neck and then slightly in front of the body and into the underside of the neck. That's now one united wash. It's all one big wash, and I'm now dropping more saturated tone or saturated colour using the phthalo and the quinacridone. Whilst that's still damp, I'm dropping in kind of thicker, more concentrated pigment, and what that's doing is giving me these lovely soft transitions from kind of lighter shadow tones into some really deep, dense, dark shadow tones. And I'm really choosing to push these dark shadow tones this dark because I want a high contrast. I want a really strong feeling of sunlight, and not always the case, but in this case it's certainly true. I'm going for a very strong feeling of bright sunlight, so I'm choosing to have very, very dark accents and almost like dark cast shadows, and that's going to really stretch the tone and really stretch the feeling of strong sunlight. So that's kind of the neck area done. We still need to come back and finish off the face. One thing I'm trying to do is find interesting shadow shapes and then create interesting little shapes in the way that they kind of connect into the light as well. So I'm connecting the shadow shapes together as one, then the transition from the shadow into the lighter areas on the whole is tending to be slightly sharper marks, but I'm trying to make that kind of transition from light to shadow kind of interesting, not just a straight line, make it like an interesting shape. And this kind of lower area I'm on now is a good example of that. So I've moved into a much stronger purple colour, so this is kind of ultramarine. Tiniest touch of red, almost incidentally more than anything else. And at a stronger consistency of probably about single cream initially, that gives the darker tone. Just looking for a simple abstract shape of dark in that area. Not thinking too much about exactly what it represents, just kind of trying to make a nice shape out of it basically, and push that tone a little bit darker, and then in spots while it's still damp, push it a little bit darker still. Kind of almost linking that straight into the leg, and then linking that leg shape straight into the turquoise, so keeping the same sort of tone but changing the colours ever so slightly as I go, creating a bit of a dark shadow, almost like a reflection off the leg, but being sure to leave lots of light as well, especially that nice little light where the leg meets the water. So sticking with the size 10 brush, I'm now using a slightly lighter tone, so more like full fat milk consistency than the slightly darker single cream consistency. Similar sort of colour, more of a bias towards ultramarine. And just again a few of those little darker marks where we transition from the shadow into the light, just trying to again create sort of interesting shapes. And what's nice about this is we can sort of give the illusion of a very almost kind of quickly painted or painting, or almost like the shapes are quite abstract and big bold brush strokes, but at the same time I am taking some care to make the shapes accurate, so we're back to this kind of simple but sort of accurate process or kind of principle. And also we're kind of pretty much working on sections like we worked on
the beak, and then that came into the back of the head, that came into the neck, and now we're working on one small section of the body, and that's kind of finished to a point. I'm now kind of going to the tail and starting to make that work. So we're kind of almost sectioning off the bird and working on little bits at a time, and also not labouring or working those bits too heavily. So we're moving into a stronger mix now of the blue with some quinacridone red, a little bit of phthalo because it's so greeny with any red, which will kind of cancel it out a little bit. And that will give us lovely deep darks. As always, that kind of phthalo mixed with a red is a nice dark combination. I find it a little bit more lively and a bit more exciting than, say, just using black. And what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to force myself to remember that this kind of lower back and lower wing and lower tail area is not the focal point. The idea here is that the head and the neck, and to some extent the nice dome shape of the sort of the shoulder area behind the head, that's kind of strongly silhouetted against a pure white background at this point. So our eye is kind of drawn to that area. It's got a strong, recognizable silhouette against a lighter background. The lower area is not the focal point. It's kind of just the supporting act. It doesn't need to be overly refined. I don't need to make it too complicated. I certainly don't need to bring it up to the same level of finish as the head. If I do that, there is a potential that it will kind of distract and detract from the focal point. So I want to put just enough information in there to make it interesting, but on the whole I'm trying to keep it a little bit brushier, a bit more abstract, and not so defined as the head. It will naturally do this anyway because a lot of the colour from that lower area kind of bleeds into the water and you can't quite tell where one becomes the other, so that helps to kind of tie it all together and create a larger, more simplified kind of mass in the bottom right corner, and then that allows the head to kind of speak out a little bit more. And what I'm doing at the moment is just trying to find that simple connection of shadow shapes. What I'm not doing is going in and painting every single feather exactly as it is. I'm quite often blurring my eyes or squinting my eyes and looking for the simple version, and the simple version in this case for me, and everyone will see it slightly differently, is a kind of darker blue colour and some simple abstract shadow shapes that I'm just sort of linking together. And again, we come back to this idea of linking the shapes together. Although this area looks quite complex and there are little kind of isolated marks, on the whole I am doing my best to at least tie them together. So while these initial marks are still damp, I'm maybe softening an edge or continuing that wash into a nearby wash, just in order to bring it together as one kind of cohesive unit rather than lots of fractured little independent parts. There's nothing wrong with those fractured independent parts in places, but we need to be very careful there's not too many of them. Then when that's all still wet, I go in with my kind of phthalo and red mix at probably about a double cream, if not kind of almost neat paint Marmite consistency, and I just start to really sharpen up that tail shape. Doing this while the initial that bluey wash is still wet will give me some softer edges. Like I can do a sharp edge over the dry paint, and then when I take that brush stroke and hit it into the damper blue wash, it kind of softens that brush stroke down a little bit and helps tie everything together. So it's a funny little area. It's very, very abstract, and I'm trying to give the illusion of what's going on. I'm trying to give enough definition to make it interesting without doing so much that it detracts from the head, and these are some of the challenges. And a lot of this area is either completely dry or as good as dry, so that allows me to work with kind of the almost like a dry brush technique over the top. And this is when I find that watercolours really come to life. I quite often liken it to oil and acrylic, where we start putting on the lighter, thicker paint suddenly the painting begins to feel a little bit more finished. It's similar, funnily enough, in watercolour when we start adding those little dark accents, even those little bits of dry brush work. Like I'm doing in the beak now, this is quite a neat paint. It's a darker colour, little dark accent, dry brush work, helping to define and refine areas, and suddenly the painting starts to feel more finished. And for me, and again every artist is different, but for me what I like to see is this combination of the very watery washes that all kind of flow together, slightly darker tones that are maybe a little bit more interesting abstract shapes but have a bit more definition to them, and then very finally some much sharper shapes but not too much of those, and a little bit more of kind of a dry brush, darker accent kind of feel to the brush marks. So that for me is what kind of really brings our watercolours to life. It's not quite as simple or simplistic as there are just 3 stages, but I almost think of it as 3 stages, like big initial wash, fairly light, then we come in with our half tones and our slightly darker tones, slightly smaller shapes, slightly more abstract shapes, but yeah, adding definition. And then once we've got all of that in place, our finishing touches are, like I said, those darker kind of accents and dry brushwork. And it doesn't mean that we do the whole painting in those 3 stages. You've almost seen, like, we might do those 3 stages within a smaller area to complete that area. So the tail and wing area, I've just kind of done that. We started with the big loose wash. I then put in some of those darker tones, trying to link the shapes together a little bit, and then just to finish it off we went in with those darks and the dry brush to make it really pop. So what's happening now is I'm basically taking the same principle into the head. I'm mixing some fairly strong paint, kind of double cream paint, if not almost neat, and I'm just going in and using the small brush just to create some nice sharp lines. And you can see it's just as we start to put in those dark accents, it's starting to strengthen the feeling of light. It's starting to make the face shape kind of come out a little bit. I take a little bit of that darker shadow into the small shape under the chin and push that just a little touch darker. And really important to leave that tiny little negative shape, tiny little dot of light between the kink of the neck and the lower part of the head. If I lose that, I obviously can put it back in with an opaque body colour, but it's nice to have it in there. It's an important tiny little negative shape to have in there. And just slowly but surely pushing the depth of tone within the beak, within the face a little bit darker. I find a quick blast of the hairdryer, like if it's starting to merge together too much, like that dark is starting to melt into the beak a little bit too much, and if it does that and makes the beak too dark and heavy, it won't quite look as I was after. So I almost use the hairdryer to almost like set the wash. It's like, I like how far the wash has melted together, but I don't want it to melt together any further, so I quickly set a hairdryer on it and it kind of fixes the wash where it is. So it has a nice wet into wet feel, but I've had a bit more control over it. And we're kind of homing in on these really small areas now. Probably not the most exciting stuff to watch, but I want to let it run at real time just so you can get a sense of kind of the pace of the painting and how we've worked from kind of big shapes through now to the smaller shapes at the end. How I'm just taking that time to not necessarily add detail, but just taking that time to just very carefully sharpen, define the odd area, refine the odd area, using a little bit of that orange now to almost just create a line over the top of the beak to trap the light a little bit more. It doesn't have to be so literal on the beak, like just using a little bit of line in places I find really effective, and I actually like a little bit of line work. I enjoy that. We don't really want to get into the trap of drawing lines around everything. We kind of want to, you know, I've let the light on the front of the neck, the light on the shoulder meet the white of the page at this point, and that's kind of almost like a lost edge. So we don't need to kind of be too linear, or we don't need to delineate every single edge. We can create edges by using different areas of tone, different types of brush strokes, but we can also use little bits of line here and there just to kind of hint at an edge, and then the viewer's mind and eye tends to fill in the rest. It's just how little can we get away with showing, rather than how much can we put in, how little can we put in, is quite often what I find myself thinking, or how little can I get away with showing and still get across what it is that I want to get across. So we're kind of swiftly homing in on finish here. We're not far off, but there are those little details still to do. And see, the painting naturally kind of slows down, as you would expect it to. There's kind of that burst of energy at the start of the painting, and then kind of it picks up pace again, and then it kind of slows down again, and then as we start pushing towards a finish, the whole thing starts to come together and the pace starts to pick up a little bit, and then we might slow down again in certain areas. So I guess one of the things that's important is understanding that paintings naturally, whatever your experience level, have a bit of a rhythm and a kind of pace to them. So like I said, we're right on the final stretch here, and I'm just using a tiny bit of white body colour. In this case it is white gouache, not the sort of thing I want to use too much at all. It's like little shots and accents of it just to pop things to life. Some of them maybe not even needed. You have to be very, very careful. But I chose to just break up some of the big areas of shadow in the lower area. Just break it up with a little shot of light. Want to use it fairly thick and neat. Little shot of light for the eye. And we really are kind of drifting on. And that little negative shape that I spoke about, that tiny little dot that's so important between the kink of the turn of the neck and under the head, I just strengthen that ever so slightly with the body colour of white. And just the odd shot here and there, and that's basically it. I think it's important to say, as always, I've not gone in and tried to perfectly recreate or represent the photo. The photo is fantastic, but there's lots of things that I've not done in it, like the big shadow falling across the body I've ignored. I felt like that would be a bit out of place in this painting, not always, but in this one I've more focused on the overall shape and form and the overall feeling of light. I've tried very hard to create a simplified version of the subject. Very hard to create a simplified version of the face. How can I, as I said, what's the minimum amount of information I can put in there and still give the illusion of my subject and still give the illusion of sunlight? What can I get away with not putting in? So there we go, guys. I hope you enjoyed that one. As always, I had great fun painting it. As I said at the start, one of my favourite groups of birds. I just love those neck shapes, and then the way the light falls across this one in particular, I really enjoyed painting, and I was really happy with the end result. It was fun working on a slightly smaller scale but doing a slightly bigger bird, really playing with those abstract shadow shapes. If you did enjoy this, please do consider subscribing. I am planning to do these a little bit more regularly, the quick watercolour birds, as well as the other subjects. Don't forget to hit the notifications bell and give me a thumbs up, really helps me out. If you're interested in seeing a lot more of this sort of stuff and a lot more in-depth learning around other subjects and even other mediums, you can join me on Patreon. My links are in the description below, along with my social media links, the podcast, all of these other little places you can find me. I completely forgot to do a line drawing for this one, I'm afraid, but you can also get the reference photo over on Patreon. It's completely copyright free from unsplash.com. I think that's everything. All of my plugs out the way. Until next time, guys, happy living, happy painting, and I will see you soon.